Holder writes back and says, my people don't think he committed espionage. And then Brennan writes back and says, charge him anyway and make him defend himself. So they charged me with 5 felonies, 3 counts of espionage. They waited until I went bankrupt, and then they dropped the espionage charges. Yeah.
Oh, God, that's so gross.
That's Washington.
It's just so hard to believe that the United States of America government works like that. I believe it.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to swallow.
There's a book by Harvey Silverglate, who's a professor of law at Harvard University. The book is called 3 Felonies a Day. And he says that we are so over-regulated, so over-criminalized in this country that the average American on the average day going about his or her normal daily business commits 3 felonies every single day. So if they want to get you, they're going to get you. And there's nothing you can do to protect yourself.
So what was Brennan's beef with you? Was it just because of the fact that you did that interview, or was there underlying tension?
We were never pals. I've known John Brennan for 35 years. We never really cared for each other. To tell you the truth, I thought the guy was in over his head intellectually. When I first started there, he was a deputy group chief. He was a GS-15, nobody, journeyman, first line, second line manager. No big deal. There are hundreds of them. And he worked for this really wonderful woman, a great intellect, named Martha Kessler. And Martha was so highly respected. She had written this book. I still remember the title, called Syria, Fragile Mosaic of Power. And when you got hired, you got her book, and you had to read the book. It's like, this is what we do. This is the perfect example of what we do. So he was her deputy. One day, he went to her, and he said, Martha, I've been your deputy for X number of years. I think I'm ready for promotion into the Senior Intelligence Service. And Martha said, and I just talked to her daughter a couple of weeks ago about this. Martha said, not only will you never be a member of the Senior Intelligence Service, I don't even want you working for me anymore. You're fired. Well, you're not really fired at the CIA. If you're fired, that means you have 6 weeks to walk the halls and find another job. If you can't find another job in 6 weeks, then they escort you to your car, they take your badge, and, so long. Good luck. Well, the normal job turnover is in the summertime. This is the week before Christmas, 1993 or 4, I can't recall now. And there are no jobs open at Christmas, so he finally finds one job. It is in the PDB staff, the President's Daily Brief, and it is as a morning briefer, giving the President's Daily briefing to the lowest ranking person entitled to a PDB briefing. So that's the National Security Council's Director for Intelligence Programs, who happened to be this guy named George Tenet. And so they immediately hit it off. 2 alpha dogs, cigar smoking, hard drinking. There used to be a kiosk right at the corner of 17th and Pennsylvania Avenue, adjacent to the White House, that sold cigars. Tenet had a heart attack and he wasn't supposed to smoke, and his wife would yell at him. So they would, after the briefing, they'd walk out to the kiosk and buy cigars and just stand there and laugh and, talk about chasing women or whatever. Totally hit it off. Then Tenet becomes the deputy director of the CIA. So he brings Brennan back with him and makes him Martha Kessler's boss, deputy director of the office that Martha's working in. He calls Martha Kessler in and says, now you're fired. And so she just elected to retire. Well, he ended up being identified by Tenet as the guy. Like, this is my guy. This guy's going places. He needs operational experience because he's been an analyst and an analytic manager all these years. I'm going to make him the station chief in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He's an analyst. He's never served overseas before. Never recruited a spy, ever. It wasn't his job. Now all of a sudden he's the station chief in one of the most important stations in the world. So he does that for a long time. By the way, during which he approves the visas for the 9/11 hijackers. And then he comes back as the deputy executive director of the whole CIA, right? So it's director, deputy director, executive director, and then the deputy directors for operations, intelligence, science, technology, administration. And they're dotted lines. So he's now one of the 5 most senior people in the entire CIA. He does that for a couple of years and then becomes the executive director. By the time I get promoted to be the morning briefer for the director and executive assistant, I'm throwing all these stupid terms out, executive assistant to the deputy director for operations, I'm meeting with Brennan every single day. So we're doing the Iraq War, we're doing terrorism and Al-Qaeda and all this stuff. He didn't like me, and I didn't like him. And then when I became the quote-unquote human rights guy, that just kind of sealed it for me. But I didn't care, because I didn't respect him anyhow. I will say that Jim Pavitt, the deputy director for operations, legendary officer and a really great guy, he hated Brennan more than I did. And he used to mock Brennan, because Brennan at the time was telling everybody, I want to head my own agency. I want to head my own agency. And they finally put him in charge of this thing that was temporarily called the TTIC, the Transnational Terrorism Information Center. It later became the National Counterterrorism Center. And they sort of shunted him off there. And it was a nothing analytic organization, not even in the headquarters building. It was out one of the outlying buildings. And then he kind of went away. But where he really did right for himself is in 2007, there was this wave of retirements, right? We're enough now beyond 9/11 that people can begin to retire. So this huge wave of senior level retirements in 2007. And then once these guys retired, half of them went to the McCain campaign and half of them went to the Hillary Clinton campaign. And John Brennan was literally the only one who went to the Obama campaign. And he saved himself.
Wow. So, how did you wind up going to prison?
Well, as soon as Barack Obama became president, John Brennan decided he was going to have my head. And so he asked Holder to have the FBI grab me. And I'll tell you what, they knew they didn't have a case. So there's a little bit of background. From 2009 to the end of 2011, I was the senior investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, working for John Kerry. It was a terrible job. Kerry said, I want you to do this and do that, and we're going to investigate this, investigate that, and then he would kill all the investigations because he wanted to be Secretary of State, and he didn't want to piss anybody at the White House off. So I can't talk about how Afghanistan produces 93% of the world's heroin, and all of it is because the CIA said they could. I can't talk about the Dashti Laili massacre, where 2,000 Taliban soldiers were suffocated to death in container trucks because the CIA didn't punch holes for them to breathe in the containers. Can't talk about any of that stuff because you want to be the Secretary of State. So I left in 2011. And right before I left, I got a call from a Japanese diplomat. And this is one of the things that I loved about that job, is this constant engagement with foreign diplomats. Right? Who's doing what, and what do you think about Israel? What do you think about China? What do you think about what's going on in, Mexico or Cuba or whatever? And I get a call from this Japanese diplomat, and he invites me to lunch. And I said, great. We meet at a place on Capitol Hill. And I remember that lunch very well. I remember we talked about Israeli elections, we talked about Turkish elections, and we talked about the Arab-Israeli peace process. And at the end of the lunch, he says to me, and I should add, his English was so bad that we had to do the lunch in Arabic. So he said, what's next for you? And I said, well, I think I'm going to resign soon. I promised Senator Kerry I'd give him 2 years. It's been 2.5. I have 5 kids, and I really need to make some money and put my kids through college. And he goes, oh, no, don't do that. if you give me information, I can give you money. And I said, what the fuck is wrong with you? You have any idea how many times I've made that pitch? Shame on you, cold pitching me like that. And I got up indignantly and I walked out. And I walked, I mean directly without stopping, to the office of the Senate security officer. And I knocked on the door, went in, I said, hey, I was just pitched by a foreign intelligence officer. And he goes, was it that damn Russian again? And I said, no, it was Japanese. He goes, Japanese? I said, I know, right? He goes, well, no, sometimes they poke around looking for trade information. I said, this didn't have anything to do with trade information. I don't think. I don't know. We didn't even get that far. He said, okay, do me a favor. He said, I've got a standalone computer here that's not connected to the internet. Write it up as a memo, and I'm going to courier it over to the FBI. So I sat there and I wrote the whole thing, blow by blow. The next day he calls me, and he says, 2 FBI agents are going to come up and talk to you. And I said, okay. So they come up, I recount the whole lunch, and they said, all right, here's what we want you to do. We want you to call him back, invite him to lunch, and then try to get him to tell you exactly what information he wants and how much he's willing to pay for it. And I said, because I'm a patriot, I said, you want me to wear a wire? And they said, no, we're going to be at the next table. We're going to listen to everything. I said, but he only speaks Arabic. That's okay. We got a guy who speaks Arabic, don't worry. I said, all right. So I call him, I invite him to lunch. We go to lunch, do the whole thing. But before the lunch, right before the lunch, they called and they said, operation came up. Just write us another memo. Do the lunch and write us another memo. I said, fine. So I wrote another memo. They asked me to do it a 3rd time, a 4th time, and a 5th time. The 5th time, he says to me, I have great news. He said, I got my dream job. I've been promoted and I'm going to be the deputy ambassador in Cairo. And I said, congratulations. I shook his hand, never saw him again. So I've written all this to the FBI. One day in January of 2012, so I've been out of the Senate for about 9 months, the FBI calls. And I look at my cell phone, it says Federal Bureau of Investigation. I was like, I wonder what that's all about. So I answer. And they said, hey, you remember that thing you helped us out with a year ago? And I said, yeah. And they said, we've got a similar situation and we need your help. And again, because I'm a patriot, I said, anything for the FBI. I kicked myself now for saying it. I said, anything for the FBI. What do you want me to do? They said, come down to the Washington field office Thursday morning at 10. I said, done. I go down there the next Thursday, and they're waiting for me at the entrance, which I thought was odd. And we go up to a conference room, and they said, we're both cleared, SI, TK, Gamma, and then there were 2 compartments above top secret that I was cleared for that they said they were cleared for. And so if the conversation necessitated it, we could go into that area. So they said, well, before we start, I just wanted to ask you, just read your book. It was great. I loved it. Hey, what about this that you said in your book? And I was like, yeah, okay. Yeah, it was a cool story. What about this other thing? Yeah, I had fun. I said, it was kind of hard. It took me 9 months to write the book, 22 months to get it cleared. Oh, yeah, you got it cleared. Yeah, of course I got it cleared. 22 months it took me to get it cleared. I'm thinking, what an odd question. Then they start asking me about something called the Sam Adams Project. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. And then the bad cop of the 2 says, we know you've been giving information to the Guantanamo defense attorneys. I said, what are you talking about? And then I said, wait a minute. Are you investigating me? And they said, yeah, and we're raiding your house right now as we speak. And I said, thank God. I said, I want to speak to my attorney right now. That was the only reason that they didn't arrest me. And one of the things that I learned, and this became painfully evident when they started arresting January 6th people, was the FBI in Washington likes to make its arrests on Thursdays because there are no federal arraignments on Friday. So you're in the DC jail Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night, getting the shit beaten out of you. And then they arraign you on Monday. And then you want to make a deal just so you don't ever have to go inside that prison again. But because I asked to see my attorney, they let me go. So I called the attorney as soon as I got out of the office. Actually, when I was walking out, one of them went over to, I didn't know it at the time, but it was Peter Strzok. And Peter Strzok says, "Tell me he implicated himself." And the guy said, "Not really, no. We have to let him go." And so I grabbed my cell phone and I left, went to the attorney's office. They had already called my attorney and said they were charging me with espionage. I hadn't committed espionage. They knew I hadn't committed espionage. And in fact, since then, I'm fast forwarding a lot, 3 FBI agents have reached out to me. Well, 2 to my attorneys. One reached out to me directly to apologize, saying that this came from the top. They thought it was a BS case. They were sorry they were involved, but there was nothing they could do. One guy reached out to me through eBay, of all things, like to try to cover up the trail. He's like, "Listen, I've been losing sleep over this for the last 13 years. I just wanted to tell you how sorry I am. Blah, blah, blah." It's like, well, I hope you feel better. My whole life fell apart. But I'm glad you got that off your chest. So it became a matter of just survival after that. You know, you have to take it seriously. I was facing 45 years in prison. And then when the Justice Department made a request for a proffer meeting. The proffer meeting is they'll give you a little idea of what they have against you, and then they make an offer. You can take it or leave it. And they offered me 45 years. And I said, I'm not doing 45 minutes. I didn't do anything wrong. And this woman, she became Deputy Attorney General for the criminal division under Biden. She said, "Take this deal, Mr. Kiriakou, and you may live to meet your grandchildren." Oh, it was... I went home that night, and I'm ashamed to even say it. That night, we put the kids to bed, and my wife and I were watching TV, and she said, "Come on, let's go to bed." I said, "I can't sleep. There's no way I'm going to be able to sleep." And she said, "No, come on, let's go to bed." She knew I was going to go down into the garage, turn the car on, and just lay across the back seat. And she said, "No, come on. You need to try to get some sleep." And she saved me that night with 45 years. And so they waited 10 months before they were even willing to engage in a conversation. And then they offered 10 years on a Monday. On Wednesday, they offered 8. And on Friday, they offered 5. My lead attorney was this legendary guy named Plato Kacharis. And Plato said, "You know, I've been a criminal defense attorney in this city for 52 years. And this is the first time I've ever seen them come down in time." He said, "Usually they offer you 10, you say no, the next offer's 15, then the next offer's 20. I said, "Why are they coming down in time?" He said, "Because they have a shit case and they know it's shit. And that's why we're going to go to trial and we're going to win this thing." I said, "Great." Well, they stayed at 5. And then they came back and they said, 3.5. And I said, "I'm going to trial. I'm going to win this thing." Turned out, at the time, my best friend, his wife, had an uncle who was O.J. Simpson's jury consultant. And she called him for me and she said, "Hey, my friend John, he's in this situation." He's like, "Yeah, I read about this in the papers. He could use your help." He came up, didn't charge me a cent. He came up to Washington. We got him a security clearance, and which was another thing. We asked for a security clearance, and then the Justice Department called and said, "The White House said Kiriakou's attorneys have enough security clearances." And I said, "Who at the White House said we have enough security clearances?" Well, they had to tell us that it was John Brennan. No more attorneys for Kiriakou. Fisher cut bait. We're like, it's not up to John Brennan to decide if I have enough attorneys. Yeah, they have an unlimited number of attorneys, an unlimited budget. As it turned out, they spent $6 million to put me in prison. Was society really better off spending $6 million to put me in a low-security prison for 23 months? So, in the end, they said, best and final offer, 30 months, you do 23. Well, I was only the second American who had ever been charged with this crime of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1982. The only other person that was charged with it was a woman named Sharon Scranage. She was a CIA secretary in Ghana in the 80s. And she was having an affair with a member of Ghana's intelligence service. And in the course of pillow talk, she revealed the names of all of the CIA officers in the station and the names of the sources they were running. And so the Ghanaians executed these guys.
Oh my God.
She got 9 months in prison. 9 months. And they offer me 45 years for blowing the whistle on the torture program. So my wife and I stayed up all night, literally all night. And because Sharon Scranage had taken a plea, there was literally no case law. So what we found several things. We found several articles from the Harvard Law Review saying this law is unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment, and it is prior restraint, right? Like it tells you in advance you can't say X, Y, and Z. But because there was no case law, you couldn't challenge it in court. And I said, well, can't we just appeal the charge and maybe, all the way up to the Supreme Court? And they said, yeah, we can do that post-conviction. And then you're going to be 45 years waiting and hoping that the Supreme Court does the right thing. We can't do that. So I decided by 6 a.m. I'm going to turn it down. I believed in my heart I hadn't done anything right. This was political. It was a vendetta by John Brennan. And Obama, by all accounts, I had friends, of course, who were still working at the agency and working at the CIA or at the White House, and they said that Obama had this Nixonian obsession with national security leaks, and it's because that came from Brennan. Obama was a senator for 2 years. He didn't have any experience doing anything, so he did what John Brennan told him to do. And Brennan said, "You got to crack down on these leaks. They do nothing but embarrass us." So I decided I'm going to turn it down. 6 a.m., I send an email to my attorneys. I had 11 attorneys. I was paying half of them, 5 of them. And then one of them writes back and says, put on a pot of coffee. We'll be at the house by 7. So they come to my house. The 4 main ones came to the house. Plato was the first one in. Now imagine this 80-year-old, 6'2", 280-pound, mean old man. He comes in, and I said, "Good morning, Plato." And he said, "You stupid son of a bitch, take the deal." Like that. I said, "Take the deal? You're the one that told me not to take the deal. You're the one who told me we're going to go to trial and win this thing." And he says, "I only told you that to keep your spirits up." And then the second one, his partner, Bob Trout, a sweet gentleman, southern gentleman. He says, "If you were my own brother, I would beg you to take this deal." And I'm like, now what do I do? And then the third, who is the guy, Mark McDougall, one of the best attorneys I've ever encountered in my life. And the one that I liked and respected the most out of all of them. I liked all of them and respected all of them, but I felt a connection to this guy. He pulls me aside. He was a little bit angry, and he said, "You know what your problem is? Your problem is you think this is about justice, and it's not about justice. It's about mitigating damage. Take the deal." And I looked at my wife, and she's just like, "What are we going to do?" So I took the deal. And I got 2.5 years in prison, and they made me do every single day of it. In fact, we went to sentencing, and this was in the Eastern District of Virginia, the espionage court. And the reason why we didn't go to trial in the end was that the O.J. Simpson jury consultant said, if we were in any other district in America, I would say, let's go for it. We're going to win this thing. But the Eastern District of Virginia, your entire jury is going to be people from the CIA, from the FBI, from DOD, from intelligence community contractors. He said, "Buddy, you don't have a prayer. Take the deal." Yeah. It was bad.
Wow.
So at sentencing, my attorney said, Your Honor, we request that Mr. Kiriakou be sent to a minimum security work camp. She says, any objection from the Justice Department? They said, no objection. She goes, okay, minimum security work camp. No bars on the windows, no locks on the doors. You're free to come and go as you please. You're just on your honor not to abscond. And then most of the guys work, there's a little college in town, you go sweep the floors or whatever. So I got to the prison 3 months later, and it's weird, the system that we have, Joe. You walk up and you knock on the door and you say, hi, I'm John Kiriakou, I'm here to turn myself in. That's all you do. And your friends and family just drive away. And so they said, you got to go across the street to the actual prison. They'll process you, and then they just bring you back over here. And I said, okay. So I go across the street. And I said, I'm John Kiriakou. I'm here to turn myself in. And the guy takes me by the arm. We go outside, and we start walking around to the back of the prison. And I said, no. I'm supposed to be at the minimum security camp across the street. And the guy laughs at me, and he goes, not according to my paperwork, you're not. And I was like, oh my God, take it easy. We later learned Brennan was so angry at the shortness of my sentence that he told them, make it as difficult as possible. So I told myself, take it easy. If you make any ruckus, they're going to put you in solitary. Don't say a word. So I didn't say a word. It took them about 40 minutes to process me. Then they walked me to my cell. The only thing the cop said to me, he says, a word of advice, buddy. If anybody comes into your cell uninvited, that's an act of aggression. And I said, great, thanks. I'm here 40 minutes and now I'm going to get my ass kicked. I appreciate it. And then I started that whole odyssey.
And so what kind of prison were you in?
I was in FCI, the Federal Correctional Institution at Loretto, Pennsylvania, which is a low security prison, but it's called a low medium, and then there's a high medium. So this was low medium. It took me 5 days to get access to a phone. And I called Mark McDougall, the attorney that I liked so much. And I said, Mark, they put me in the actual prison with the pedophiles and the mafia dons and the drug kingpins. I said, what do I do? He says, oh my God. Well, he said, we could file a motion, but it'll be 2 years before we get a hearing and you'll be home by then. He said, buddy, I'm sorry. You're going to have to tough it out. And so that's what I did.
So you have this long career working for the government. Mm-hmm. They put you away. And what is it like for you to feel so betrayed and to get out? And what do you do when you get out?
I was frankly very angry when I got out. I didn't realize how angry I was. Like, people would mention it to me. Like, maybe you should talk to somebody. Maybe you should, think about a pharmaceutical option. And I was like, why? There's nothing wrong with me. I'm ready to fight and march and, raise my fist against the Obama administration. And so I was wrong, of course. I was so angry that it wasn't even healthy for the people around me. But I'll tell you, Joe, the hardest thing is you think you can just step back into your life again, and you'll never be able to step back into your life. So I thought, okay, well, I'm highly educated. I have a bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern Studies. I have a master's degree in legislative policy analysis. I finished my PhD classwork in international affairs. I got rejected by McDonald's, by Safeway, by Target, by Uber. We don't hire felons. I mean, I couldn't get a job anywhere.
And you're broke.
And I was broke. Bankrupt. Mm-hmm.
So you couldn't even get a job driving for Uber?
Uber turned me down. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. But you know what, though?
What did you do?
Well, I was confident that I was right and they were wrong. And my wife, Unfortunately, she's now my ex-wife, but she gave me some of the best advice anybody ever gave me. She said, you have to keep telling your side of the story because eventually they're going to move on to their next victim. And if you keep talking, your side of the story is going to be the side of record. And eventually the truth is going to come out. And sure enough, 6 weeks before I was released from prison, I called her. I was allowed to call her every other day for 15 minutes. So I called her and I said, how was your day? And she said, it was great. And I said, really? Great? Why was it so great? And she said, because the Senate torture report was released today and it proved that everything you said was true. And I said, that is great. And she said, John McCain stood up on the floor of the Senate and said if it weren't for John Kiriakou, the American people would never have had any idea what the CIA was doing in their name. And so when I got home, God bless him, one of the first calls I received was from John McCain's chief of staff. And he said, Senator McCain says, welcome home, and he wants to know what he can do to be helpful. And I said, oh my God. I said, tell him I said thank you. I liked McCain very much from when I was working on Kerry's staff. Kerry was a little jealous of McCain. And McCain would go out of his way to shake my hand and say hi. Kerry said to me one time, why don't you two get a room or something? And I said, no. I said, we have this connection over torture. I said, McCain takes me seriously and I take him seriously. And so when I spoke to McCain, I said, these damn Obama people, they confiscated my pension. And I'm going to have to work until the day I die. They drove me into bankruptcy and took my pension. So he came up with this idea. It was a great idea to write an amendment. My attorney wrote this amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act of 2016. And it said that every American convicted of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act between October 1st and October 31st, 2012, shall hereby have his pension reinstated. So, of course, I'm the only person in the world that refers to. So he said, nobody reads these 1,500-page bills. We're going to slip it in there. He said, I'm going to be on the conference committee. We'll get it taken care of. And then he got sick. He got a brain tumor. And he wasn't named to the conference committee. And so they pulled it back out again. And then he died. And so here I am, 10 years later. The only way that this can be made right is with the presidential pardon. And that's what I've been working on for years now.
So what did you do for money?
I was offered a job at a small think tank in Washington called the Institute for Policy Studies. And they said, we'll give you an office, but you're going to have to raise your own salary. And so it was just like constant GoFundMes. I did that for a year. I made $20,000 for the year. And I said, I can't do this. It's untenable. And so I just decided, look, no company is going to hire me, right? I can't go back into government again. And so I'm going to have to work for myself. So I had already written my first book, made number 5 on the New York Times bestsellers list. My second book I wrote longhand from prison. I ended up winning 2 literary awards for that book. I won the Penn First Amendment Award, which along with the Penn Faulkner, Pulitzer, and the Edgar Allan Poe is one of the big 4. And then I won the Forward Review's Memoir of the Year that year. I thought, I'm going to keep writing books. I started writing a column that ended up being syndicated through the Consortium for Independent Journalism. So it's like 200 small town papers around the country. And, a little bit here, a little bit there, consulting. And then the Greek government. I happen to be Greek American. My grandparents all came from the island of Rhodes. As soon as I was arrested, like within a day, the Greek ambassador called me and he said, what can we do to be helpful? And I said, you can give me citizenship. And man, like that, I got Greek citizenship. And so as soon as I got out of prison, the Greek government hired me to help them write the new whistleblower protection law. And then they passed it quickly. The parliament passed it into law, and then the European Union adopted it. So I went to Brussels and I testified there, and then they repackaged it. Now it's the law of the land in all of the European Union. And then people in the States began taking me more seriously. I started doing some paid speaking gigs. I got hired as an adjunct professor at a couple of different universities. And then, after a while, you can make an okay living. I'm still going to have to work until the day I die because I have literally nothing saved. It all went to the attorneys. And, hope for the best. I will say that I was a third-generation Democrat. I left the Democratic Party ages ago. John Brennan and Barack Obama's actions convinced me that I had done the right thing. And now I have found common cause with populist Republicans. You don't have to agree on every issue, right? You don't have to like everybody and everything that they believe in and everything they stand for. But I've struck up a great friendship, for example, with Tucker Carlson. Sweetest guy in the world. And a great supporter of mine. And Judge Napolitano. It's a love fest every time the two of us get together. And I realized that, this political system we have, it's antiquated. It doesn't work. You have to engage with the individual. Like, I never thought that I would be agreeing with Marjorie Taylor Greene on some of these civil liberties issues, right? Or Thomas Massey, or Bernie Sanders for that matter. But I've realized that I've got to stand up for what's right, not what the DNC happens to think what's right, or some politician that I used to think I had respect for thinks is right. A couple of nights before I left for prison, the former director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, who later became the deputy director for operations and was very close to Brennan. He was the DDO when Brennan was the director of the CIA. He tweeted at me and he said, "Don't drop the soap," with a laughing emoji. And I gave myself a couple hours to cool off. And then I texted back and I said, "Jose, I'm on the right side of history and you are not." And that gave me such peace. I knew I could go to prison, survive this just fine, and come out and still make an impact. And, knock on wood, that's how it's worked out. It's ugly. And you get to prison. One of my attorneys said, "Hey, I've collected a list of 600 email addresses from people who want to know how you're doing. Once you get there, once you get comfortable, just send me a letter and I'll send it around to these people." I said, "Okay, great." It took me, you don't realize it, but you're in shock for the first week or two. And then I started settling into the routine. And it was it was pretty screwed up. That first day, 20 minutes after the cop warned me about people coming into my room unannounced, these two guys just walk in boldly, I jump up, I put my fists up, I go, "What do you want?" One of them has a swastika on his neck. It took up his entire neck. It came up onto his face. The other one had "fuck you" tattooed on his eyelids. So I go, "What do you want?" And the swastika guy says, "You the new guy?" I said, "Yeah, so?" And he says, "You a fag?" I said, "No, I'm not a fag." He said, "You a rat?" I said, "No, I didn't have anybody else in my case. I'm not a rat." And he says, "You a chomo?" I go, "I don't know what that word means." He goes, "Chomo, child molester." I said, "No, I'm not a child molester." And he goes, "Okay, you could sit with the Aryans in the cafeteria." And I was like, "Oh, I guess I'm with the Aryans now."
Oh,
grand. Yeah. And then the guy across the hall from me was the boss of the Bonanno family. And one day he said to me, I would get the New York Times and he would get the New York Post, and we would trade at the end of each day. He asked me, "Let me ask you something," he says. "Why you sit with those Nazi retards in the cafeteria?" I said, "I don't know, Pete. My first day here, they told me to sit with them." He goes, "From today, you're with the Italians." And I said, "Awesome." And they became my closest friends. I mean, I got a book out of it. They were absolutely wonderful, honorable, honest, fun. The smallest so-called gang in the prison, but the one that commanded the most respect. And once word was out that I was with the Italians, it was hands off. And it was thanks to one guy. Shout out to Mark Lanzalotti. Mark was from Philly, and he saw in the New York Times I was going to be assigned to that prison on a Sunday. I was assigned on Thursday, and he took it upon himself to go to every one of the Italians to say, there's a CIA guy coming here. He's not an FBI agent. The FBI are cops and rats. The CIA protected us from the Muslims. And they're like, oh, okay. And so it was, welcome. No problems.
God, it has to be insanely stressful.
It was like living in the Twilight Zone. The stress will kill you. It's incredible. You see people break down all the time. They just lose it. And it's not like you're gonna, be taken out to some medical unit someplace. You go to solitary, and you can live or die down in there. Yeah. Oh, so I was telling you, so I waited about 6 weeks before I was comfortable enough to write a letter. So I very arrogantly called it Letter from Loretto because I had such respect for Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And so I said 2 things in this. I mean, I talked about the food and I talked about the Italians, but I said 2 things. I said there was this one guard who was really abusive. She was absolutely horrible. You know that phrase, rode hard and put away wet? That was this woman, all tatted out from the neck down, and just a nasty, mean old, awful person. So I was walking through the hall one day, and she said, "Hey, are you that motherfucker whose name I can't pronounce at mail call?" And I go, "Kiriakou," just like it's spelled. She goes, "How about if I call you fuckface?" Like that. So I said, "Classy," and I walked away. Somebody later told me, they're not allowed to talk to us that way. That's a violation of, code 11.8, subsection, B, whatever. So I wrote it in the letter, and I was just like, life in prison, what am I going to do? This woman swears at me, there's nothing I can do. The other thing was more important. I had been there 3 days, and one of my cellmates was an Australian arsonist. And he said, "Let me walk you around and introduce you to the guys." I said, "Okay." We go to this other housing unit, and there's a little tiny guy there who didn't speak any English. And he said, "This is," I forget what his name is, Ahmed or something. He's from Iraq. And I said, "Ana sharaf bima'riftek. It's very nice to meet you." And he says, "تتكلم عربي. أنا عرب. أنا من Iraq." I said, "Yeah, great. You're from Iraq. I was in Iraq. It's very nice to meet you." Turns out he was there on a terrorism charge. He was the imam of some mosque in New York, and somebody was trying to sell a Stinger missile to somebody, and he translated the document, the bill of sale, and he got wrapped up in this terrorism case. So I get called into the lieutenant's office the next day. And usually if you're being called into the lieutenant's office, you're going straight to solitary. So I hear my name, Kiriakou, lieutenant's office, immediately. Always with immediately. And they know you can't do it immediately because all the doors are locked. So I wait for a 10-minute move period. The bells ring, and I go to the lieutenant's office. I said, "You wanted to see me?" And they have this guy's picture on a computer screen. "You know this guy?" I said, "I don't know him. I met him yesterday." "What'd you say to him?" I said, "Nice to meet you." "What did he say to you?" He said, "Nice to meet you too." "Oh yeah? Well, after you walked out, he called a number in Pakistan, and they told him to kill you." I said, "Get the fuck out of here. I could kill this guy with my thumb." No, don't do that. We've been looking for a reason to transfer him out." I'm like, okay. So every time I see this guy, I give him the stink eye, right? And then he gives me the stink eye back. But then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, that doesn't make any sense. He's Kurdish. He only speaks Arabic and Kurdish. Why would he call a number in Pakistan when they don't speak Arabic in Pakistan? That just didn't make sense. So I saw him in the yard, and I went up to him, and he got kind of scared, like he was going to try to defend himself. And I had 6 inches and 100 pounds on this guy. So I said, wait a minute, just want to ask you a question. Did the cops say anything to you about me? And he said, yeah. I said, what did they say to you? And he said, they told me that after we met, you called a number in Washington and they told you to kill me. And I said, oh, they did they? So I went back to the law library and I looked this up, and this was a Class D felony. It was conspiring to commit violence in a federal facility. It's punishable by up to 5 years in prison. So I wrote it in my letter and I sent it to my attorney, and I didn't give it a second thought. I didn't know my attorney was friends with Arianna Huffington, who then put it on Huffington Post with this banner headline, millions of hits. The next thing I know, Jake Tapper drives to the prison to interview me, and it's everywhere from CNN to Playboy to The Economist and Time Magazine, when Time Magazine was a thing, and NPR's calling the prison to interview me, and the next thing I know, I'm called to the warden's office. Well, that's in an off-limits part of the facility. So the warden calls me in, he's like, I'm gonna send you to solitary right now. And I thought, is now the time to be humble before the warden, or should I stake my claim? And I said, warden, with all due respect, I've gone nose to nose with Al-Qaeda, with Hezbollah, with the Iranians, and you want me to be afraid of you? Give me some credit. He said, yeah, we'll see what you say when you've spent some time in solitary. I said, I've lived in Yemen, in Pakistan. I'm not afraid of your Loretto, Pennsylvania solitary. Besides, I said, go ahead and send me to solitary. CNN's going to be waiting for you next to your car in the parking lot. And I just looked at her. I never went to solitary, not for a minute.
Wow. Jeez. So they're just trying to set you guys up. Mm-hmm. Trying to get you guys at each other's throat.
They did it one other time. One of my attorneys.
Do you know who orchestrated that?
No.
Do you think it was the warden himself?
No, I don't think he was smart enough. I don't think he cared enough. It had to come from the agency. Oh. There was one other incident too. I lived in the same block of cells with an Afghan-American pharmacist who had an oxy problem. Nice guy. And he came up to me one day and he said, hey, the spokesman for the Taliban is here now and he wants to meet you. I said, the spokesman for the Taliban? I said, are you talking about that case in New Jersey? And he said, yeah. I said, I don't have anything to say to the spokesman of the Taliban. I don't want to meet him. And he said, oh, okay, I'll tell him. So I'm out in the yard one day, and my attorney had warned me, they're upset at the shortness of your sentence. So be very careful. They're going to try to set you up and add years on. So I'm out in the yard, and here comes this guy with a beard down to his waist, and he's got his hand out to shake my hand. And I put my hands up so as not to touch him. And I look just past him, and there's a guard in the woods outside the thing with a long distance camera lens, and he's going click, 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 click. And I said, don't you even think about touching me. And he said, oh, come on, man, come on. We have a lot in common. I said, we have nothing in common. I spent half my career trying to kill people like you. I said, get away from me. Don't touch me, or you're going to end up unconscious on the ground. And he walked away, and then he got transferred out. And I said, isn't it interesting that the spokesman for the Taliban was sent to our prison and was only here for 4 days? Isn't that interesting? And then they just gave up.
This kind of stuff is so hard.
It's America. You don't want to believe this about America.
You want to believe what it does.
Yeah.
And you want to believe that you'd never turn on their own like that over something that's just.
Yeah, but they do.
But the crazy thing is, it's like the CIA torture program wasn't even effective.
No, that's the thing. It wasn't even so effective. Nuts. But you know what, though, Joe? When these guys die, and they've started to die, in their obituaries, it's going to say, that they were among the creators of the CIA's torture program. And so they have a vested interest in repeating this lie over and over and over again, that it was the right thing to do.
What I don't understand is, wouldn't they want to be effective?
You would think.
That's
if they were clear-headed, yes.
That's the only thing that makes the least sense to me. Like, idealistically, I like to think of the people that are in charge of the CIA of having a very important role in national security.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in a position where you have a very important role in national security, it's imperative to do what is most effective. And if torture is not most effective,
then don't do it.
Then you would abandon torture and use those coercion tactics that the other guy was using.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, they ended up abandoning the torture program. Yeah. Mitchell and Jessen took their $108 million and they retired to Florida. And then subsequent CIA directors following George Tenet said, yeah, this didn't work. We're not going to do it anymore.
God. I mean,
I have to laugh just because it's so nuts. What else can you do?
It's beyond nuts. It's disgusting. And it's just amazing that they could get away with it.
Yeah, and they have. Nobody's been prosecuted. Nobody.
Does Trump know about all this stuff?
About my stuff?
Yeah. Like, have you ever
I don't
tried
know.
to get a pardon out of him?
I've tried. Let me rephrase. I am trying. So I have a letter that Ronald Reagan's former Deputy Attorney General generously wrote, asking the president to pardon me. Tucker Carlson signed it. Judge Napolitano signed it. Doug Deason, who's a friend of the president, signed it. Sid Miller, who's here in Texas, has signed it. And the president's former U.S. attorney in Utah has signed it. And then, and I sent it to Ed Martin, the U.S. pardon attorney. And then other people have said, oh, I would have signed that. So we have a second letter. Dr. Phil has agreed to sign it. There are a couple of other people, high-level people. Ken Higian, who is the head of the president's transition team, has signed it. There are a couple of others. We had really good news yesterday from CIA Director John Ratcliffe. And he said that the CIA has no objection if the president were to pardon him. That's a big deal.
That's great.
We have also a nice one-sentence statement from Tulsi Gabbard saying that she has no objection to a pardon. So, I don't know, man. I'm hoping for the best. You know what they say in business school? Hope is not a strategy. But I genuinely don't know what else to do.
Now, you're doing all these conversations. You did the conversation with Tucker, you did his show, you're now doing my show, you've done a bunch of other shows. Do you have any concern that in exposing more of what has been done to you, that it somehow limits your possibility of being pardoned because you're exposing so many people that may still be working there?
I'm told that all of my detractors are either dead or retired. A friend of mine from the CIA called me the other day to say something very funny, that she was sitting in a mandatory security briefing, and she said one of the slides was just a picture of me, and it said the insider threat underneath. And she said everybody started to boo, and the instructor said, why are you booing? And one of the guys said, he's not an insider threat, he's a whistleblower. And she said, in the next running of the class, my picture was removed. So I won, and John Brennan lost. That's really what it's come down to.
Ugh. It's so hard to hear these stories.
It's terrible.
It's so hard to imagine that our government could be so disgusting.
Oh my God, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, truly.